If 2025 had a theme to it, it'll probably be open the damn gates. It feels like a lot of new camera releases are going to add the 3x2 open gate feature, which makes a lot of sense because a lot of sensors are 3x2, so you may as well let us shoot in it. Now, in today's video, we're going to be talking about the Canon C50 versus the Lumix S1II. This isn't a prescription of what you should buy, however, these cameras are actually pretty similar, and in some ways, they're also really different. Yeah, we're going to compare these two cameras, but we'll get there. Now, as far as disclosures go, nobody paid me to make this video at all. It's not sponsored, nor Canon or Lumix paid me to make this video. I do have an S1II on a long-term loan, and I do give the C50 back at the end of this week if you're watching this video. Although neither company paid me to make this video, in fact, I spent a lot of money kind of making this video on my own. So yeah, if you want to buy any of my LUTs or use any of the links in the description down below, that would help maybe make money back on the amount of money I've spent driving and booking studios and all the other stuff. Probably not though, but that's okay. Now, we're not going to go directly into body shaming between these two cameras. In fact, we're going to go directly into image quality. Now, I decided to try to shoot these guys in a variety of different modes because a Canon C50 can shoot in a 7K open gate RAW format, where the Lumix S1II can shoot in 420, but it can still shoot in open gate nonetheless. Now, just straight up putting these beside each other, honestly, the Lumix actually holds up pretty decently, especially noting that it does shoot at 420 and the data rate is significantly less than shooting in 7K RAW on the Canon C50. The Canon C50's RAW is kind of somewhere between like 17 and 1500 megabits per second, depending if you're going to go RAW ST or LT, whereas a Lumix S1II caps out at a whopping 200 megabits per second in 420 versus the RAW. And when you're looking at these two side by side, the images actually look pretty decent. I actually think I like the highlight roll-offs and the transitions on the Lumix S1II's image, but I got to do this in a couple of other variations in order for me to have a coherent opinion about it. Now, some people might say that this is not exactly a fair fight because the Lumix S1II, believe it or not, can have internal RAW as well. Now, the caveat with this, guys, you do have to shoot in 17:9. And when using ProRes RAW besides C-Log2, the images actually look pretty comparable to each other. In fact, I feel like with a little tweaking, you can make them look exactly the same. One of the things with using raw footage is oftentimes you get a lot of control on the back end, but the output is going to be pretty much the same because overall, it's just going to look good. Just having raw gives you more ability and more information in order to do that. Now, I've tried this a couple of different times. I didn't find a difference in the dynamic range in any of these images, 420 or otherwise, and as well as being able to use raw, both of the images look really good. They both look sharp. They're shooting at 7 and 6K respectively. However, again, I'm going to say it, I feel like I like the highlight roll-off and the shadow fall-off on the Lumix S1II. Now, you guys might be watching this and have different opinions, but when I'm looking at this, I don't feel like the Lumix image is as sharp, if that makes any sense. Now, working with either flavor of RAW is going to have some workflow implications, especially in your camera RAW tab. Now, Apple ProRes RAW was only available on DaVinci Resolve a couple of weeks ago, and I could just kind of open this guy over here, go to camera metadata, go to clip, and I'll be able to change things like my ISO in post. I could change my log curve to Panasonic Vlog, which we'll do right now, and I could change what my exposure bias is and my color temperature, as well as like using my capture temperature and my captured ISO just in case. This kind of leaves a lot to be desired, as this entire part of this tab doesn't even exist. Now, when I go onto the Canon side of things, I go over to here, I'll do the exact same things. I'll go to clip, and also if you go to full res Canon, you can change your ISO in post. Somebody commented that and I didn't know that. But you have the ability to change your color temperature, your tint, your exposure, even the sharpness as well on the raw level. You can also change things like your shadows, highlights, color boost, saturation, midtone detail, and everything else. This gives a lot more information that you could push and pull in terms of your image versus, well, that. This is a lot nicer. Now, both the Canon C50 and the Lumix S1II have multiple log curves that you can use in their cameras. Now, for the sake of ease and also because I don't think anybody likes C-Log3, I'm going to use C-Log2 versus the other log curves on the Lumix S1II being V-Log and RE-Log-C. For all intents and purposes, I am using RE-Log-C for the rest of this video, except for like this section. Now, when I put these guys side by side, I do think I like the RE-Log-C a little bit more. Keep in mind, and just so we're on the same page here, you can color grade these to look like each other, but when I put these three side by side, a lot of people made comments on my previous video that the Canon looks a little bit more magenta on the skin tones, and looking at these guys, I tend to agree. However, you could always just change your tint in your skin node and you're gonna be just fine, but putting these three side by side, again, all three of them look really good. However, we're splitting hairs here, and the Canon C50 looks absolutely phenomenal, which also was shown in a previous video. So I'm not here to say that like one is astronomically better than the other. They're both just different. I also want to test this against my dark skin tone for two separate reasons. One, I just wanted to see what they look like side by side, especially in a sensor that leans a little bit more magenta, because typically sensors are a little bit on the green side or somewhere in the middle. But I also want to check out if this autofocus on someone who's darker skinned. The reason why I say this is because I was a previous owner of the R5, the C200, and the C70. And all three of those cameras had a really bad struggle with dark people's skin. And if you're someone who is melanated that has a Canon camera, comment down below if you've ever been done dirty by the autofocus that is Canon's. Now we are going to go into the body and some of the design features of either one of these cameras because they are pretty different. For one, they both have tally lights, they're both full frame cameras, they even use the same memory cards, from a CF Express Type B as the main card and an SD card as a secondary card. You can still proxy record on either one of these two guys as well, so it makes your life a little bit easier, and CF Express Type B cards are a little bit cheaper than they used to be, so using that as a stable format, especially when both these cameras can shoot internal RAW, is going to be something that's going to be useful. They're also going to have mode switches as well between photo and video, and the S1II does have an S&Q switch, whereas the C50 you just have to turn on your S&Q mode in the menus. However, the photo switch on the C50 actually gives you a completely separate menu. Kind of like the R5C, it does use two operating systems between photo and between video. That way, if you need to get a quick photo, you don't necessarily have to change from all of your video settings, and when you go back into your video settings, they're all saved exactly how you had them. Now, one of the things I did mention on the C50 is that the top handle in combination with this whole camera package is the best thing that Canon's ever made. It's incredibly ergonomic, it's easy to handhold, and I love the balance of it, especially when you're using like a zoom lens or an adapted lens to PL. This is something that's going to help a lot of run and gun shooters because it gives you an extra point of contact that's a little bit easier, as well as the top handles also used to get audio as well. Now, keep in mind the Lumix S1II is going to be much cheaper than the C50, and what you could fit into that price differential is the ability to get an XLR module at the top of the S1II, which also gives you the ability for 32-bit float. Now, you're going to get normal 24-bit on the top handle going into the C50, but if you want to yell as loud as you can into your microphone on the S1II, you can definitely get one. However, it's not in a top handle configuration. So if I'm keeping score, I'm going to give a point to the top handle on the C50, mostly because it's my favorite feature. Now, both these guys also feature active cooling, or fans for short. However, they're going to be a little bit different, and I'm just going to rip off the Band-Aid. I tried to do an overheating test between these two cameras, and honestly, I just kind of gave up because the S1II didn't win. It didn't win. Now, some of you guys were going to get mad at me if I didn't do an overheating test by exposing the back of my camera in direct sunlight, shooting at the highest shooting mode, and then just kind of leaving it there. Now, I am going to rip off the Band-Aid in terms of overheating. Now, I'm going to also say in regular use, I don't have overheating problems on the S1II. However, I try to run these guys for long takes just to find out which one was going to overheat first. Spoiler alert, the Canon C50 didn't overheat. When you put both of these fan settings on high, because I figured that makes the most amount of sense, using it in 7K RAW, there was no overheating problems. I even tried at 4K 120 frames a second, and I filled the card before the camera even got hot. Now, on the S1II side of things, we're learning that if you're in a hotter environment, and especially if you expose the back of the camera directly towards sunlight, the camera is going to get hot and overheat at some point in time. Whether that's going to be 15 minutes, 20 minutes, or 90 minutes, it doesn't make a difference because it's like comparing a car that can do 200 miles per hour versus something that is the Flash. Because it doesn't matter how fast a car goes, a Flash is going to be faster than that car. Now, in terms of exacts, because I tried to run this test a couple of times and I just got a little bit of a different result every single time, I get about an hour shooting in 6K open gate, which is almost as much as consuming an entire battery, and as well as I got a little over half of that while using that in 6K 60. To be exact, like 26 minutes and 42 seconds. So if you are shooting indoors, you're probably gonna have a pretty good time with recording on your camera, but the fact that it overheats at all means the C50 kind of automatically wins here. And if you wanna find a gigantic spreadsheet or lots of information about overheating on the S1II, it will leave in the description down below that gives the best amount of information as well as a spreadsheet in terms of which modes will cause overheating and which times they are based on the cards that you're going to be using. But the C50 1000% wins on this one. Now, the Lumix S1II, despite having a lot of video features, is also still a hybrid camera, and that means it is going to have a viewfinder in case you want to take photos on that 24 megapixel sensor. Now, some people were asking about why didn't the C50 just have a viewfinder to it. It's just called the R5C. You could just get the R5C and then you don't have to worry about the viewfinder part. I also want to point out just a little thing that the S1II does, which I really like, is that when you turn the camera off, a little thing comes down in front of the sensor to protect it from any dust or dirt that can get into it. The Canon C50 does not do that, despite the fact that Canon C50 actually costs more money. And also, I think the R5 does it as well, but they didn't put it into this camera. I'm also not going to forget the fact that these two have vastly different screens. Now, I don't know how many million dots are on either side of the screen, but I do like the fact that the S1II has that fully kind of side four-way articulating screen, and then the C50 just does, well, it does this. Like all the other cameras, it just does this, which I think is fine. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, but you know, I like to be able to have more options. Now, we are going to talk about using some of the high frame rates between these two cameras, because both are capable of shooting at 60 and 120 frames a second, but there is a little bit of nuance. For one, both cameras are going to be able to shoot at a 17:9 Cinema 4K or DCI, and that's pretty fine. However, on the S1II, you're going to be able to still shoot in 3x2 open gate at 60 frames a second, except you're going to shoot that at 5.1, which isn't necessarily a gigantic resolution drop, but the Canon C50 could only shoot up to 30 frames a second when you're shooting in 7K raw open gate. Now, there was somebody that commented in a previous video where they really wanted to have 4K 120 frames a second with audio on one of the new Canon cameras. Unfortunately, the C50 can't do it either. You have to shoot in the S&Q mode at 4K 120, but you're not going to get the audio track. However, on the S1II, you do. So if you want to shoot in 4K 120 frames a second, the S1II is probably the option for you. I'm also going to be real with myself. I don't use 4K 120 frames a second that much anyways. It's mostly going to be for people that shoot like sports or weddings for the most part, or at least that's what I've been told, or other specialty shots. But if you need 4K 120 frames a second with audio, the C50 isn't the camera. Now, being able to even access these modes are going to be a little bit different on the menu systems and navigating those on either one of these two cameras. For one, the S1II actually does have a Big 6 menu, similar to how you would have on the FX3 and the FX2, and you could choose and change from a variety of different settings. Now, the Canon C50 does have its own, I guess, kind of version of the quick menu. When you tap on one of the buttons in the corner of the screen, you could quickly change things like your white balance or ISO, and as well as it has a separate menu where you could change your shooting modes fairly quickly. It's just not set up in the Big 6 menu variant, which might be a little bit easier to navigate. However, both of them have the ability to have some form of a quick menu. Now, one thing I did mention in my C80 video last year that some people got really upset about was the idea that navigating through some of the different shooting modes and resolutions and bit rates and all the other stuff just to find the frame rate you're looking for is a little bit annoying. Now, I will say that there's a little bit of leeway here because that like quicker menu that I just mentioned that actually goes through some of the settings is a bit easier to navigate, but in the main menu, it's still kind of hard to find and figure out which frame rates I'm going to get with which mode. Now, again, I'm saying this on the Lumix S1II, there's so many modes that it could get a little bit overwhelming, but a saving grace is two things. One, it at least tells me the codec and the frame rate that I'm going to get based on the 167 options is going to be there, and as well as it gives you the option of even filtering through those different shooting modes, so that way you can eliminate all the ones you don't need and only have the option of the ones that you do. For example, if I'm just looking for 3x2 open gate 24 frames a second, it'll just spit that one out to me based on the resolution and all the other stuff I might need out of a filming mode. Another thing that the C50 doesn't necessarily have, and I feel like I'm dunking on this with the S1II and I'm really not trying to, is if you want to get a LUT as a viewing assist, you just can't do it on camera. Like, you can, but it's only going to give you a Rec 709 or a CMT 709, which I guess for some people doesn't really matter. If you want to get that in camera, you just want to look at what a Rec 709 looks like on the C50, that's more than fine. However, not only can you use your own custom LUTs in the S1II as a viewing LUT, but also you could mix and match and trade them, edit them, send them back to your phone or share them with your friends using one of the two apps that are going to be available for the S1II, which is going to be Lumix Lab and Lumix Flow. Now, the Lumix Lab app I've mentioned before in previous videos, but it gives you the ability to not only dump footage into your phone, but also you could edit some of the colored looks in there and send it back into your phone, or you could send those LUTs to anybody else that's around you, provided they also have the Lumix Lab app and they have a Lumix camera. Whereas on the C50, if you want to have an image that doesn't look like flat to saturated log, you can get it in Rec 709, you just can't get it in anything else unless you're going to use an external monitor. Now, most people in video situations are going to use external monitors, but I kind of like the idea of being able to see what a look looks like before I actually shoot it, and where the other option is in being able to load in a custom LUT. It bakes it directly into the file, so I don't necessarily get it as a viewing LUT. I could still embed a LUT into there, but I'm just kind of stuck with whatever that look looks like, and I can't change anything later. Another app that Lumix does have is going to be the Lumix Flow app. This is kind of like a camera control app. You could use it wirelessly, or you could use it via USB-C, and you could use your phone as a monitor, and that's going to be a way where you could control some of the settings on the S1II. The screen articulates really great, but it's not the brightest screen in the world, so you might want to use your phone, and that's completely up to you. Although, in honesty, I haven't used Lumix Flow a lot, but I have used Lumix Lab quite a bit. And if you are somebody that has an R5C and you're really frustrated that the camera multi-camera app doesn't work, Theoretically, it does work on the Canon C50, but I do think that the firmware update hasn't happened yet, so I haven't been able to test the app on the C50 just yet. And I won't be able to until the camera releases, which is going to actually be closer to December than the October date that I posted this in. All that to say, it's not necessarily fair to compare apps between these cameras when this one hasn't even released yet, so I can't really use the app to find out which one is better. Now, speaking of things that have a little bit of nuance to them, it's going to be stabilization. Now, the Canon C50 and the S1II do have stabilization just in their unique ways, where Lumix has honestly some of the best IBIS in cameras, and it's really hard to argue with that, and it's actually inside of the body. You're going to get a variety of different stabilization modes, and just to make a fair fight, I only did one handheld shot in order to do this, but there is going to be a caveat with the stabilization in Lumix cameras versus the C50. Now, Canon does have in-body stabilization, but it's more of the digital variety, and we've all been familiar with something called the Canon wobbles, which I was actually able to demonstrate later on in this video. However, you can get in-body stabilization in their lenses. Now, this is something where I do wish Canon did have some prime lenses that also had IS as well, because using in-body stabilization or like physical stabilization versus digital kind of just goes over a little bit better. In the examples that you guys just saw, if I'm doing a walking tracking shot, using the S1II is going to be a little bit smoother, and that's just because Lumix has knocked it out of the park with stabilization, and it's really hard to get anywhere close. Whereas the Canons, it's not the worst when you're using a stabilized lens, but when we get to the wobbles later on in this video, it's apparent. Now, on the flip side of this, and this is also going to be saved for another video, so I'm going to try not to ruin the surprise, but there are going to be situations where having a stabilized sensor isn't actually going to be the play here. Now, I did talk about this in the previous video when I was talking about the robot arm shoot, but that's going to be versus the FX3, and it's going to be important. But I decided to actually try car rigging this guy, but I actually decided to try car rigging this guy and the Lumix S1II, obviously using the Kofi cups. Now, Griffin Conway, if you want to see a video talking about automotive shooting and using Canon cameras in order to do that, he actually prefers not to have IBIS because you do get a little bit of lag or unnecessary vibration even when the IBIS is turned off. Now, there is going to be one caveat here, and I'm not going to wait all the way to Anamorphic to talk about them, but if you want to activate the in-body stabilization on the Canon C50, you can't shoot in RAW or 3x2 open gate either. You got to shoot in 16:9. You got to shoot in one of the 10-bit modes in order to activate the in-body stabilization if you want to use it in combination with the lens itself, which is going to be kind of frustrating if I'm being completely honest, because I want to be able to use IBIS no matter what shooting mode that I have. We're going to take a little break here and do a ridiculous rolling shutter test. Now, I only decided to do these in both modes, in open gate and in the 17:9, mostly because when you go higher up in frame rates, the divisible, the readout speed just gets divided by the frame rates you're going to use. However, when shaking this back and forth, it doesn't look that bad on either camera. There. That's rolling shutter. Now, we're going to be talking about autofocus. I'm just going to leave the footage in order to play, and then you guys can see the results and make your own decisions. However, I'm going to introduce a little bit of a caveat, which I don't really see a lot in autofocusing tests when comparing cameras. Now, if you get all the way through this little wave drill that I'm putting Earth through, you'll notice that the autofocus is sometimes hunting, sometimes missing, sometimes going all over the place. And that's actually going to happen between the Canon camera and the Lumix S1II as well. The reason why this is happening is because I'm not necessarily using the proper mode and giving context of the autofocus that I'm going to be getting. If you're working with a fast moving object that you want to make sure is tracking and they're also moving inside and outside of the frame, you want to make sure that A, your autofocus is going to be responsive, and B, it's going to be fast enough to catch up with your subject. This might be a mistake that some people encounter and then they write off the entire autofocusing system, but one thing you want to keep in mind is that the context of the thing that you're shooting is going to impact the modes that you're going to put on there. Now, when I turn this up to maximum speed and maximum responsiveness, it actually performs way better because I've looked at my scene, I looked at what I'm trying to shoot, and then I just made my settings work for that particular type of shoot. This isn't necessarily to give a prescription of which one I think is better between the S1II and the C50, but also just to say if you're testing out the autofocus in any camera, make sure we keep in mind exactly what we're trying to autofocus on, whether it be a fast-moving subject or a slow one. There's absolutely no way I'm going to talk about two cameras that are able to shoot an open gate and not talk about anamorphic and anamorphic support. And also that I think other companies should have anamorphic support in open gate, but that's nor here nor there. But the Lumix S1II and the Canon C50 both have the ability to shoot in 3x2 open gate. Now, what that does mean is that you are going to get a little bit more real estate, especially when you're shooting on anamorphic lenses on the top and the bottom. You just get a little bit more to work with, and you don't have to pay any extra money because for the most part, open gate capable cameras are going to be cheaper than the ones that aren't. You know what I'm talking about. Now, what's nice about the Canon C50 is that it does support open gate. You do have built-in D-squeeze, and that way you're going to be able to monitor your image instead of looking at a de-stretched kind of mess that people will find, which actually makes it a lot harder to manual focus on. And also a lot of anamorphic lenses are manual focus. So it would make you upset in two different directions. Now, between that and the S1II, which you've already seen enough S1II anamorphic footage, I post it all the time, which also leads into the idea there's going to be two caveats that the S1II does better than the C50. Crap. Well, the S1II has the ability to shoot in slow motion in anamorphic while going down to 5.1K because it can't shoot 60 frames. Where if you are going to be shooting in 7K on the C50 and 3x2 open gate, it's at 30 frames a second. Now, like we mentioned before, you can use 6K 60 in order to get a slow motion shot. It just kind of defeats the purpose. I swear to you, I'm trying to be as even keel as possible. Now, the C50 doesn't have in-body stabilization, at least in the traditional sense. It uses digital, but I actually prefer not to use the digital IS and just do things in post on DaVinci Resolve. A little bit of stabilization could go a long way. And the reason why is because once we get into the actual in-body stabilization adjusted for the 1.5 times squeeze for anamorphic, you could totally see the wobbles in here and it's a little bit off-putting, and I would prefer not to use it. However, on the Lumix S1II, it does have in-body anamorphic stabilization, which makes it a bit different. So this is going to be a low light test between both cameras. Now I'm going to shoot at their native ISOs, which is going to be 500 in RA log C on the S1II and 800 if you're going to use the C50. I'm also going to double zoom in so we can see a little bit of the noise, but I'm also going to say that no light doesn't mean low light. So I would say try to light your scenes. Don't try to shoot in pitch black because you're going to get noise no matter what you're going to do. You just can't make something out of nothing. Now, when trying all of these guys out, I also wanted to use their dual base ISOs as well at 6400 on the C50 and 4000 on the S1II. One thing I'm going to notice and note as well is that the S1II does have built-in noise reduction. However, when you're looking at some of the images, I don't even think noise reduction could save how hard it clips when I do go into that second base ISO. And as well as I did try to do 12,800 because both of these cameras are trying to be the FX3, so I decided to do that as well. But when looking at both these images, you're going to get noise in either one of these guys. However, I will say the C50 doesn't fare the best in this particular scenario. Now, I am going to note as well that you can use noise reduction that would help clean things up quite a bit and make things even with the S1II, and I am going to do that on the side-by-sides here. But I will say in terms of being able to get a little bit more going farther up into that ISO, at the 12,800, the S1II does perform a lot better than the C50, albeit neither of these two cameras have a native ISO at 12,800. But at the same time, if you're someone that really needs to push things a little bit more, which honestly, I don't really have in a lot of situations, the S1II does a little bit better in the low light department. However, when we're looking at these side-by-sides here, you're going to get noise in either one of these guys. I also put on the little vector scopes in there as well, so that way you can see if there's going to be a bit noise just by looking at the charts. And I think the S1II, I think because it has the noise reduction built in, fares a little bit better. However, I noise reduce some of these shots, and I still think the Lumix looks better than the C50, if I'm going to be honest with myself. Now, what I'm trying to do here is just show you the footage as I captured it side by side and not make prescriptions of the world and tell you what to buy, because some of you get really mad whenever I do that. So what I am going to say is I'm just going to lay out the price and let you make your decisions. At the time of this video, the S1II is $31.99, and as well as the C50 is $38.99. Now, for that significant price jump, I do think a lot of the things that I like about the C50 over the S1II is going to be more about the exterior than what it can do on the inside. Now, that's not to say that the Canon C50 has a bad image compared to the S1II. I just spent like 25 minutes telling you last week that this camera image is actually great, and I still stand by that. However, the S1II being significantly cheaper and also not necessarily being as robust in some of the modes still holds up really well and also at a cheaper price. Now, that also to say that Lumix S1II, whether it's 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or 45, will overheat at some point in time if you're doing long takes, or you're doing that whole bareback situation in front of the sun. Where the Canon C50, if you want something where you can kind of just throw it around and shoot willy-nilly for the rest of your life maybe, I think this is going to be very unlikely to overheat, at least in my experience. So if you're somebody where that $700 as an insurance policy to make sure that it never overheats in any situation, well, then the Canon C50 makes a lot more sense. I also hope that I don't have to eat my own foot, because if somebody gets us to overheat in a situation, there's nothing much I could do. I live in Canada. There's maybe someone else will do this too. Now, one of the things that both cameras need is going to be a better ecosystem, especially in their lenses. I mentioned this in a previous video that the Canon RF mount being closed is one of the things I think holds Canon back as a brand and having more consumers actually buy their cameras. Where on the flip side, Lumix does have the L mount alliance. However, there are a couple of lens brands or a couple of lens variations that the Lumix cameras just don't have. For example, the Laowa 10mm f2.8 lens, which I talked about earlier this year. Both these cameras being open to more third parties on Lumix's side, just having brands actually want to make L mount lenses, and then on Canon's side, just making it available to get third party lenses at all, I think are both things that are going to help out both systems. At the end of the day, who do I think each camera is for? And I'm going to tell you this for, I guess, the fourth time. I don't know. Because again, the tools are going to be a little bit different. We're in a completely different landscape. So people that value certain things are going to be a little bit different. And who am I to inject myself and my own personal bias to tell you what you should buy? I'm just here to give you the information. However, I will say the differential between $31.99 and $38.99 might be things like being able to have that audio top handle, which I like a lot. I like the audio top handle quite a lot. And a camera that you're going to have a bit more insurance with because, well, I haven't got this thing to overheat. Where I've got this thing to overheat, albeit in situations that I generally don't really shoot in, but I got it to overheat nonetheless, which is a concern for some people. If you're in those environments, maybe you're shooting out at a hot wedding or something like that, this guy might be the more secure option, despite the fact that maybe it doesn't have as many shooting variations in open gate, but at the same time, who's going to say no to 7K RAW, anamorphic support, and all the other stuff that comes within the C50? That being said, that's the whole video. I did a comparison between these two cameras, and we finally stopped openly gatekeeping, and now we kind of know a little bit of what each one does. I will say I probably missed something. There's probably a detail or something else that I missed. I only have 2 weeks with the C50, and I had to make this video in about 3.5, 4 days. However, if there is anything that I did miss, you can leave it in the comments down below. Just do so respectfully. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.